7 solved mysteries with incredible explanations. Stones dropped by the gods, mysterious disappearances and underwater rumblings. Everyone loves a good mystery. There have been countless mysteries through history that have captured the public's imagination, from bizarre disappearances to strange archaeological discoveries. Often, the greatest mysteries are the ones we've never come close to explaining. Much of our attraction to mysteries is in being drawn to the unknown, although from time to time it's nice to know the answers. A quantifiable explanation is behind even the most puzzling mysteries, and the answers that come from solving them have often expanded our knowledge of the world around us. This list takes a look at 7 solved mysteries, both old and new, that had truly remarkable explanations. From our understanding of ancient cultures to the truth behind seemingly disturbing discoveries, every one of these mysteries, along with the stories behind them, are sure to capture your imagination. 7. The Antikythera mechanism. A 2,000 years old mechanical computer salvaged from a Roman shipwreck has astounded scientists who have finally unraveled the secrets of how the sophisticated device works. The machine was lost among cargo in 65 BC, when the ship carrying it sank in 42 meters of water off the coast of the Greek island of Antikythera. By chance, in 1900, a sponge diver called Elias Stadiatos discovered the wreck, and recovered statues and other artifacts from the site. The machine first came to light when an archaeologist working on the recovered objects noticed that a lump of rock had a gear wheel embedded in it. Closer inspection of material brought up from the stricken ship subsequently revealed 80 pieces of gear wheels, dials, clock-like hands and a wooden and bronze casing bearing ancient Greek inscriptions. Since its discovery, scientists have been trying to reconstruct the device, which is now known to be an astronomical calendar capable of tracking with remarkable precision the position of the sun, several heavenly bodies and the phases of the moon. Experts believe it to be the earliest known device to use gear wheels, and by far the most sophisticated object to be found from the ancient and medieval periods. Using modern computer X-ray tomography and high-resolution surface scanning, a team led by Mike Edmonds and Tony Freeth at Cardiff University peered inside fragments of the crust-encased mechanism and read the faintest inscriptions that once covered the outer casing of the machine. Detailed imaging of the mechanism suggests it dates back to 150 to 100 BC and had 37 gear wheels enabling it to follow the movements of the moon and the sun through the zodiac, predict eclipses and even recreate the irregular orbit of the moon. The motion, known as the first lunar anomaly, was developed by the astronomer Hipparchus of Rhodes in the 2nd century BC, and he may have been consulted in the machine's construction, the scientists speculate. Remarkably, scans showed the device uses a differential gear, which was previously believed to have been invented in the 16th century. The level of miniaturization and complexity of its parts is comparable to that of 18th century clocks. Some researchers believe the machine, known as the Antikythera mechanism, may have been among other treasure looted from Rhodes that was en route to Rome for a celebration staged by Julius Caesar. One of the remaining mysteries is why the Greek technology invented for the machine seemed to disappear. No other civilization is believed to have created anything as complex for another 1,000 years. One explanation could be that bronze was often recycled in the period the device was made. So many artifacts from that time have long ago been melted down and erased from the archaeological record. The fateful sinking of the ship carrying the Antikythera mechanism may have inadvertently preserved it. This device is extraordinary, the only thing of its kind, said Professor Edmonds. The astronomy is exactly right. In terms of historic and scarcity value, I have to regard this mechanism as being more valuable than the Mona Lisa. The research, which appears in the journal Nature Today, was carried out with scientists at the National Archaeological Museum of Athens where the mechanism is held and the universities of Athens and Thessaloniki. 6. The Sailing Stones. It is a mystery that has baffled scientists for decades, how the sailing stones of Death Valley in California apparently moved by themselves. The phenomenon has even been spotted in other countries, most notably in the Manchego Lagoon Alta Chica in Spain. Now researchers say they have finally solved a puzzle, and say slippery bacteria in the key. Researchers from the Complutense University in Madrid have observed that wind from winter storms generates currents that can push the stones over a surface colonized by microbes. Then once the water has vanished, the mysterious trail is left on the dry bottom of the lagoon. The magic force behind these huge rocks, some weighing as much as 700 pounds, 320 kilograms, has been a mystery to scientists for nearly a century. With no human or animal intervention, these rocks seem to move by themselves, leaving behind them a trail of their route. Some specialists believe that ice sheets surround them during the winter, and this aids their movement by the wind, but Spanish scientists have come up with a different hypothesis. Now, a team of geologists from the Complutense University in Madrid, UCM, have discovered that moving stones weighing up to 7 kilograms also appear on the dry bottom of the Ulcer lagoon in Lillo, Toledo, Spain, as published in the journal Earth Surface Processes and Landforms. The trails they leave are similar to those at Racetrack Playa, and can exceed 100 meters in length. Our hypothesis is that they move during the winter, when storms are produced and accompanied by strong winds, as one of the authors Maria Esther Sanz explains to Sync. The wind is capable of creating water currents of up to 2 meters per second, which would be the real cause of the sliding stones. Ulcer has a 5 centimeters layer of water during the rainy months. The larger stones stick out and create an obstacle for the wind-induced currents. Under these circumstances, the turbulence stirs up the soil around the rocks, and creates an initial groove which is the start of a trail that can even move slightly up. However, the movement of rocks also has an unexpected ally: microorganisms. A microbial community of cyanobacteria, single-celled algae and other tiny organisms live on the bottom of the lagoon and secrete slippery substances. The muddy sediment that they produce, with plenty of gas bubbles, acts like a skating rink for the stones once they have become dislodged. Sands points out the main arguments backing up her theory. On the one hand, you can recognize the sedimentary marks or structures which accompany the stone trails, and you can observe that they follow the direction of the water currents. On the other hand, the direction of the trails clearly coincides with the prevailing winds in the area during each storm. The Spanish scientists rule out the possibility that ice sheets transport the sailing stones, at least in the case of Ulcer. This and other lagoons in the area are very salty and rarely freeze. Salt lowers the freezing point for water, reminds the researcher. These geologists consider that their proposal would work perfectly well for other lagoons in the world with movement of stones which have similar climatic conditions, including Death Valley. In fact, they have contacted North American colleagues who, given the ice hypothesis, support the role of windstorms and microbial mats in the movement of the sailing stones. At the moment, the trails left by the moving stones this year in Ulcer, a natural reserve with the lagoons of El Longer and Alto Grande, can hardly be seen, because they form during winter storms and then fade away. Even so, this season has seen the formation of at least 3 different sets of trails. Since we saw them for the first time in 2012, we have recorded 7 episodes or sets of moving stones, concludes Sands, who highlights the need for this unique spot to be conserved. The main hypothesis was that when a small amount of water was on the surface of the ground, a sheet of ice would form, trapping the rocks. Wind would then move the whole thing, with the reduced friction allowing the rocks to travel along the muddy ground. This idea had been theorized for a while, but it was confirmed in August 2014, after time-lapsed video footage showed the rocks moving during low wind speeds, across the thin, melting sheets of ice. 5. Stomach ulcers. For years an obscure doctor hailing from Australia's hardscrabble west coast watched in horror, as ulcer patients fell so ill that many had their stomach removed or bled until they died. That physician, an internist named Barry Marshall, was tormented because he knew there was a simple treatment for ulcers, which at that time afflicted 10% of all adults. In 1981, Marshall began working with Robin Warren, the Royal Perth Hospital pathologist who, 2 years earlier, discovered the gut could be overrun by hardy, corkscrew-shaped bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. Biopsying ulcer patients and culturing the organisms in the lab, Marshall traced not just ulcers but also stomach cancer to this gut infection. The cure, he realized, was readily available: antibiotics. But mainstream gastroenterologists were dismissive, holding on to the old idea that ulcers were caused by stress. Unable to make his case in studies with lab mice, because H. pylori affects only primates, and prohibited from experimenting on people, Marshall grew desperate. Finally he ran an experiment on the only human patient he could ethically recruit, himself. He took some H. pylori from the gut of an ailing patient, stirred it into a broth, and drank it. As the days passed, he developed gastritis, the precursor to an ulcer. He started vomiting, his breath began to stink, and he felt sick and exhausted. Back in the lab, he biopsied his own gut, culturing H. pylori and proving unequivocally that bacteria were the underlying cause of ulcers. Marshall recently sat down with Discover senior editor Pam Weintraub in a Chicago hotel, wearing blue jeans and drinking bottled water without a trace of Helicobacter. The man the star once called the guinea pig doctor can now talk about his work, with the humor and passion of an outsider who has been vindicated. For their work on H. pylori, Marshall and Warren shared a 2005 Nobel Prize. Today the standard of care for an ulcer is treatment with an antibiotic. And stomach cancer, once one of the most common forms of malignancy, is almost gone from the Western world. Having rid much of the globe of two dread diseases, Marshall is now turning his old enemy into an ally. As a clinical professor of microbiology at the University of Western Australia, he is working on flu vaccines delivered by brews of weakened Helicobacter. And in an age when many doctors dismiss unexplained conditions as all in the head, Marshall's story serves as both an inspiration and an antidote to hubris in the face of the unknown. 4. Amelia Earhart. Legendary aviator Amelia Earhart was attempting to become the first female pilot to fly around the world, when her plane disappeared over the Pacific Ocean in 1937. Last month, the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, TIE, proposed the theory that she landed her plane safely on a remote island, and died as a castaway. Now, scientists say a new discovery shows a striking similarity between the pilot and the partial skeleton of a castaway found on an island of Kiribati in 1940. A historical photo provided the vital clue. The legendary pilot. In May 1932, Earhart became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, taking off in Canada and landing in Ireland. 3 years later, she flew solo from Hawaii to California, winning a $10,000 prize. She was America's darling, famous for being a daring but modest pilot. Together with co-pilot Frederick J. Noonan, she was attempting to circumnavigate the globe when her plane disappeared somewhere near Howland Island, in the middle of the Pacific. In August, TIE's Rick Gillespie said Earhart made more than 100 radio transmissions calling for help between July 2 and 6, 1937, ruling out the possibility of a crash landing. Her calls were picked up as far away as Texas, Florida and even Melbourne. "She's out there calling for help," Gillespie said, adding that she must have landed safely because the radio wouldn't have worked without the engine running. A strange detail. The bones were uncovered on the island of Nikamuro, also known as Gardner Island, which is about 400 miles south of Howland Island. They were analyzed in 1940, but a doctor said they were male, ruling out the possibility they belonged to Earhart. However, when TIE discovered the files in 1998, scientists said modern techniques proved the bones were consistent with a female of Earhart's height and ethnic origin. More recently, anthropologist Richard Jantz was preparing an updated evaluation, when he noticed a strange detail: the skeleton's forearms were considerably larger than average. However, without knowing the dimensions of Earhart's body, Jantz had no way of comparing if her forearms were similarly longer than normal. Tyre turned to forensic imaging specialist Jeff Glickman for help. Using a historical photo where both of Earhart's bare arms were visible, he calculated the ratio between the bones in her lower and upper arm. Because there is tissue over the skeleton in living people, the location of each bone end must be estimated, he wrote in a report published last week. Her clothing also added a layer of difficulty, but he used the point of her shoulder, the crease of her elbow and the indent of her wrist as landmarks. Given the evidence and my experience in the field of photogrammetry and photo interpretation, I estimate that the radius to humerus ratio of Amelia Earhart is 0.76, he wrote. In other words, the difference between her lower and upper arm was virtually identical to the partial skeleton, unearthed in the South Pacific. The discovery doesn't conclusively prove the castaway was Amelia Earhart, but it's certainly another step in that direction. It's technically just circumstantial, but most experts agree that the evidence is pretty much conclusive. 3. The spiral-toothed shark's teeth. A 25-feet monster shark with chainsaw teeth, that roamed the prehistoric seas 270 million years ago, has been revealed by scientists. The bizarre fish Helicoprion, an early ancestor of sharks, had a conveyor belt of jagged teeth that spiraled out of its lower jaw and ripped prey to shreds. Using state-of-the-art scanners to create 3D virtual reconstructions of its jaws, researchers have now discovered what the ancient beast would have looked like as it homed in on marine animals. Located at the back, the teeth were saw-like with the jaw creating a rolling back and slicing mechanism. Professor Leif Tupanila, of Idaho State University, said, "We were able to answer where the set of teeth fit in the animal. They fit in the back of the mouth, right next to the back joint of the jaw. We were able to refute it might have been located at the front of the jaw." The creature, unlike any shark alive today, grew up to 25 feet in length and weighed almost half a ton, 71 stone, making it the biggest fish in the sea. The large spiral fossils of teeth are all that remain, from the 100 specimens found around the world, as its skeleton was made of cartilage, just like its modern descendants, which does not preserve well. Helicoprion's appearance has long mystified scientists, because no one could work out how these teeth, which resemble a spiral saw blade, fit into it. Geoscientist Professor Tupanila said, "New court, computerized tomography, scans of a unique specimen from Idaho show the spiral of teeth within the jaws of the animal, giving new information on what the animal looked like, and how it ate." The findings, published in the Royal Society journal Biology Letters, are based on firm evidence fed into computers at his special virtualization laboratory. Another major breakthrough was the beast is more closely related to ratfish than sharks. Both species have cartilage, rather than bone, but are classified differently. It was always assumed that Helicoprion was a shark, but it is more closely related to ratfish, a holocephala. The main thing it has in common with sharks is the structure of its teeth, everything else is holocephalan. Based on the information, the Idaho Museum of Natural History is creating a life-size reconstruction of a modest 13-foot-long Helicoprion for an exhibition this summer, which will also include artwork by world-renowned scientific illustrator Ray Troll. Rocks in southeastern Idaho have preserved the largest, most abundant and pristine specimens of Helicoprion, many of which include the lower jaw cartilage, teeth and rare impressions of skin. Other remains have been found in Utah and Wyoming, when these regions were covered in sea more than 250 million years ago, too. The bloop. In 1997, the bloop was heard on hydrophones across the Pacific. It was a loud, ultra-low-frequency sound that was heard at listening stations underwater over 5,000 kilometers apart, and one of many mysterious noises picked up by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. Several articles in the years that followed popularized one suggestion that the bloop might have been the sound of an unknown animal due to the organic nature of the noise, a theory that elevated the bloop to the level of a great unsolved mystery. However, the NOAA is pretty sure that it wasn't an animal, but the sound of a relatively common event, the cracking of an ice shelf as it breaks up from Antarctica. Several people have linked to the NOAA's website over the past week, excitedly claiming that the mystery of the bloop has been solved, but as the information on the NOAA website was undated and without a source, Wired.co.uk spoke to NOAA and Oregon State University seismologist Robert Ziak by email to check it out. He confirmed that the bloop really was just an icequake, and it turns out that's kind of what they always thought it was. The theory of a giant animal making noises loud enough to be heard across the Pacific was more fantasy than science. Ziak explained to us the NOAA's findings, and confirmed that the frequency and time duration characteristics of the bloop signal are consistent and essentially identical to icequake signals we have recorded off Antarctica. He explained, "We began an acoustic survey of the Bransfield Strait and Drake Passage in 2005, which lasted until 2010. It was in analysis of this recent acoustic data that it became clear that the sounds of ice breaking up and cracking is a dominant source of natural sound in the Southern Ocean. Each year there are tens of thousands of what we call icequakes, created by the cracking and melting of sea ice and ice calving off glaciers into the ocean, and these signals are very similar in character to the bloop. That makes it extremely unlikely that the sound is animal in origin." But he also pointed out that the hypothesis that the bloop was caused by an animal wasn't ever really a serious one. He said, "What has led to a lot of the misperception of the animal origin sound of the bloop is how the sound is played back. Typically, it is played at 16 times normal speed, which makes it sound like an animal vocalization of some sort. However, when the sound is played in real time it has more of a quake sound to it, similar to thunder. You can hear a recording of the bloop in the video accompanying this story. There aren't even that many mysterious sounds picked up by the NOAA's hydrophones. According to Ziak, nearly all sounds can be attributed to major sound categories: geophysical, submarine volcanoes or earthquakes, weather, storms, waves, wind, anthropogenic, ships, airguns, ice, sea ice, iceberg groundings, and animals. Cetaceans, fish. Anything else is usually just some kind of electronic interference with the signal. It's easy to see why the bloop was such a compelling mystery. The deep oceans are still mostly unexplored by humans, more than 95%, according to the NOAA, and only a few weeks ago an entirely new species of whale washed up on a beach in New Zealand. It was only in 2004 that the first video footage was recorded of a giant squid in the wild. To paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld, "We know there's a lot we don't know about the deep ocean." Fans of horror fiction were also delighted to note that the location pinpointed as the source of the bloop was located a mere 1,760 kilometers from the location of the sunken city of R'lyeh, where, according to H.P. Lovecraft, the mythical beast Cthulhu is imprisoned. Cthulhu would certainly fit the bill of a giant sea creature capable of emitting a sound that could travel for thousands of kilometers through the ocean, but unfortunately science has, once again, ruined the fun. Alas. 1. The fairy circles. With its bone-dry grasslands and oppressive heat, the middle of the Namib Desert may seem like a strange place to go fishing. Yet there Jennifer Guyton and Tyler Coverdale were, standing in a sea of orange sand and brittle yellow grass with their 30-foot carp pole. But the two Princeton graduate students weren't trying to catch some sort of desert-dwelling dogfish or a literal sand shark. That would be absurd. Instead, they had swapped the hook with a camera so they could investigate the scenery around something much more scientifically sensible: fairy circles. That is what scientists call the mysterious bald spots speckled across Namibia's grasslands. The rings are 6 feet to 115 feet wide, and are regularly spaced out in a hexagon or honeycomb pattern. As their ethereal name would imply, fairy circles have long bewildered researchers as to their origins. But a new study published on Wednesday in the journal Nature, that Miss Guyton and Mr. Coverdale were involved in, seeks to offer some insights into how the enchanting landscapes may have formed. Although the name fairy circles sounds sweet and peaceful, there is passionate scientific disagreement over how they arise, and the two prevailing hypotheses have become adversaries in the dispute. One side suggests that termites, locked in never-ending competition with neighboring colonies, create the circles as they fight for dominance and resources. The other says that perpetually thirsty plants simultaneously assist and compete with their neighbors' roots, causing the vegetation to self-organize into the patterns. The new study suggests that termites and plants may be jointly responsible for forming fairy circle landscapes in Namibia. And it has received mixed reviews from scientists entrenched in the dispute. We thought both sides of the debate bring in compelling arguments for each of these mechanisms, so why should it be one or the other? Said Corina Tarnita, an ecologist from Princeton University and the study's co-lead author. Dr. Tarnita worked with Wamba Nikla, a mathematician from the University of Strathclyde in Scotland, to test the termite and plant explanations in a computer model. They found that either hypothesis could generate the fairy circle features. But when they tested both mechanisms together, the model revealed a second, smaller pattern hidden within the clumps of grass between the fairy circles. Everyone was focusing on the circles and not what was happening in between them, said Robert M. Pringle, an ecologist at Princeton and another author on the paper. The next step for the team was to confirm that this second vegetation pattern existed in nature. So they sent Miss Guyton and Mr. Coverdale to Namibia in 2015 with their camera and fishing pole. Ms. Guyton said that each of the grassy patterns was as different as fingerprints, but were mathematically similar. By comparing the photos with their model, the team verified that the second pattern did exist in the grass surrounding the Namibian fairy circles. That finding, they said, confirmed that their mathematics reflected reality, and suggested that only by interacting together could insects and plants create the landscape that characterizes Namibian fairy circles. Some fairy circle experts firmly placed in either Team Termite or Team Plant had strong doubts about the paper's findings, while others welcomed it. Norbert Jürgens, a biologist from the University of Hamburg in Germany, who published the study that said termites engineer fairy circles, agreed with the overall findings and said that he hoped they would be an eye-opener for all those who since 2013 questioned the termite hypothesis. Stefan Getzen, an ecologist at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research in Leipzig, Germany, was not persuaded, saying in an email that the paper was unable to account for the presence of fairy circles, where sand termites were completely absent, as in Australia. Logically, if there are fairy circles without the presence of termites, the termite theory cannot be considered as a strong explanation for the phenomenon, he said. Dr. Tarnita responded that their model showed that both termites and plants could make the fairy circles, but that the entire system, which includes the vegetation and the small-scale patterns seen in the Namibian fairy circles, needed both. Walter R. Chinkel, a retired entomologist from Florida State University, who was not involved in the study, said in an email that the assumptions the team made about termites in their computer model were untested. There is no evidence that the real termite Samotermes illusurus does what the computer termite does, he said. But Max Rietkerk, an environmental scientist from Utrecht University in the Netherlands, said that the authors showed that the two hypotheses could have worked together in Namibia's fairy circles. He also agreed, however, that the argument could use more empirical evidence. Dr. Pringle defended the use of their model, pointing out that it drove the team to discover new empirical evidence that no one had found before, the small-scale grass patterns. Despite the team's attempt to solve the mystery, it seems the fairy circle scuffle flutters on.